The moment Jack Mitchell stepped into that hospital room, he knew his life would never be the same. The woman lying in the bed wasn't the person who had called him. She wasn't anyone he'd ever met before. But the look in her eyes when she saw him standing there, a complete stranger who'd shown up in the middle of the night just because someone needed help. That look would haunt him for years to come. What he didn't know then was that this mistake would lead him to a choice that would test everything he believed about love, family, and what it means to truly belong. It had been a normal Thursday night for Jack, well, as normal as things got for a single dad raising a 10-year-old daughter on his own. After tucking Lily into bed, he'd crashed on the couch, the exhaustion of balancing his job as a mechanic with parenthood weighing heavy on his shoulders. The phone call at 20 O's of MM had jolted him awake, the panicked voice on the other end barely coherent. "Please, I need you. Memorial Hospital room through 2. Please come now." The woman had been crying, her voice breaking between sobs. "I think you have the wrong number," Jack had said, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "James, is that you? Please, I'm scared. I don't want to be alone." Something in her voice, the raw fear, the desperation, had struck a chord in Jack. He'd been there before, terrified and alone when his wife died giving birth to Lily. No one should have to face their darkest moments without someone by their side. "I'm not James," he'd said gently. "But I can come. Just hang on, okay?" After calling his neighbor Mrs. Peterson to watch Lily, Jack had driven through the empty streets of Portland, questioning his sanity the entire way. Who rushes to a hospital in the middle of the night for a complete stranger? But he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever this woman was, she needed someone, anyone, to show up for her. When he'd arrived at room 302, he'd found her, a woman in her early 30s with copper hair spread across the pillow, her face pale against the stark white hospital sheets. The moment she saw him, confusion had crossed her face. "You're not James," she'd whispered. "No, I'm Jack. You called my number by mistake. I couldn't leave you alone when you sounded so scared." For a long moment she just stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. Then she'd done something unexpected. She'd laughed, a small broken sound that somehow contained both gratitude and disbelief. "My name is Eleanor Prescott," she'd said, "and apparently, the universe decided to send me a guardian angel instead of my worthless ex-boyfriend." What Jack didn't realize as he awkwardly took the seat beside her bed was that Eleanor Prescott wasn't just any woman. She was the sole heir to the Prescott media empire worth billions, and she was fighting a battle that all her money couldn't win. And the decision he would make in the coming hours would not only change his life and lives, but would challenge everything the world thought they knew about Eleanor Prescott. "The doctors say I might not make it through the night," she told him bluntly after they'd been talking for an hour. "That's why I called James. I didn't want to die alone." Jack had felt his heart drop to his stomach. This vibrant, funny woman he'd just met might not see the sunrise. The unfairness of it hit him like a physical blow. "Then I'll stay," he'd said simply. No one should be alone for this. What he couldn't have known was that his decision to stay that night would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to blackmail, betrayal, and eventually a love story that would captivate the nation. Eleanor had survived that night, defying her doctor's predictions. When morning came, she'd asked Jack for his number. A real exchange this time, not a wrong number in the dark. "I don't know how to thank you," she'd said. "Most people wouldn't have come. Most people haven't been where I've been," he'd replied. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor Prescott." He'd walked out of the hospital thinking that was the end of their strange encounter. He couldn't have been more wrong. 3 days later, as Jack was closing up the auto shop where he worked, a sleek black car had pulled into the lot. The driver, a stern-looking man in a suit, had approached him with an envelope. "Miss Prescott requests your presence at her home tomorrow evening at 7:00 p.m. The address is enclosed. She said to tell you it's important." Jack had almost declined. His life was complicated enough without getting involved with a billionaire heiress with health problems. But curiosity, and if he was honest with himself, concern for Eleanor had won out. The Prescott estate had been everything he'd expected and more. A sprawling mansion overlooking the city with manicured gardens and security that made Fort Knox look like a playground. He'd felt wildly out of place in his clean but worn jeans and button-up shirt as a housekeeper had led him through marble hallways to a sunroom where Eleanor waited. She'd looked better than she had in the hospital. Some color returned to her cheeks, but still fragile, like a strong wind might blow her away. She'd smiled when she saw him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Jack Mitchell, you actually came. You said it was important." She gestured for him to sit across from her. "I have a proposition for you, one that might sound crazy, but I hope you'll hear me out." What Eleanor proposed that evening was indeed crazy. She explained that she had a rare form of cancer, one that was treatable, but would require months of aggressive therapy. Her prognosis was uncertain. What was certain was that her board of directors was using her illness as an excuse to try to wrest control of her company from her. "They think I'm weak," she'd said, anger flashing in her eyes. They think they can push me out while I'm down. I need to show them and the world that I'm not alone, that I have support, that I'm still capable of making decisions. What does that have to do with me? Jack had asked, though a sinking feeling told him he already knew. I need someone I can trust. Someone who showed up for me when they had absolutely nothing to gain. I want to hire you, Jack, to be my companion, for lack of a better word, to accompany me to treatments, to business meetings, to be seen with me in public, to help create the image that I'm not fighting this battle alone. Jack had laughed, thinking it was a joke. You want to hire me to be your fake boyfriend? That's insane. I'm a mechanic with grease under my fingernails and a kid at home. I don't belong in your world. That's exactly why it's perfect, she'd countered. You have no connections to my industry, no ulterior motives, and I'll pay you well enough to secure your daughter's future, to give her opportunities you've only dreamed of. The mention of Lily had stopped his laughter cold. Eleanor had done her homework on him, it seemed, and she'd known exactly which button to push. I'm offering you 500,000 for 6 months of your time, she'd said quietly. Think about what that could mean for Lily. Jack had left the mansion that night without giving Eleanor an answer. His mind had been reeling. 500,000 would change everything for him and Lily. It would mean a college fund, a better home in a safer neighborhood, maybe even the chance to start his own business someday. But at what cost? Lying to the world, pretending to be something he wasn't, entering a world he knew nothing about. He'd tossed and turned all night, and in the morning he'd called the number Eleanor had given him. I'll do it, he'd said when she answered, but I have conditions. Lily comes first always, and I won't lie to her about what this is. Agreed, Eleanor had replied, and Jack could hear the relief in her voice. When can you start? I need to give notice at work. 2 weeks, make it 1. I'll compensate you for the last week. My first round of treatment starts next Monday and I want you there. And just like that, Jack Mitchell, single dad and mechanic, had stepped into the glittering, cutthroat world of Eleanor Prescott. What he didn't know was that someone had been watching them that night at the mansion, someone who would use their arrangement against them both, and that within 3 months, the lines between their business arrangement and something much more complicated would blur beyond recognition. The first time Jack accompanied Eleanor to a cancer treatment, he'd been unprepared for the reality of what she was facing. She'd been so composed, so in control during their meetings that he'd almost forgotten she was seriously ill. But watching the nurses hook her up to IVs, seeing the grimace of pain she tried to hide as the chemicals entered her system, had made it all too real. You don't have to stay in the room, she told him, noticing his discomfort. Most of the staff knows who I am. Just being seen in the waiting room would be enough. But Jack had shaken his head. I'm not here just for show, he'd said, pulling a chair closer to her bed. Tell me about your company. What exactly does Prescott Media do? For the next 3 hours, as chemicals designed to kill the rogue cells in her body dripped into her veins, Eleanor had talked about her father's legacy, the media empire he'd built from nothing, and her own vision for its future. Jack had listened, asked questions, and watched as talking about her passion brought color back to her cheeks. When the treatment was over and she was too weak to walk steadily, he'd helped her to the car without being asked, his arm strong around her waist. The paparazzi had been waiting. Of course, Eleanor had made sure of that. The photos of the mysterious man supporting the ailing Heiress had hit the tabloids the next day. Prescott Heiress finds love amid health crisis. The headlines had screamed, who is the handsome stranger supporting Eleanor Prescott in her time of need? Well, that worked, Eleanor had said dryly when Jack arrived at the mansion the next day. She'd been curled up on a sofa, looking exhausted but satisfied as she scrolled through the news on her tablet. Is that all that matters to you? The publicity? Jack had asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. She'd looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Right now, yes, my board meeting is tomorrow, and these photos just strengthen my position considerably. They can't paint me as a weak, isolated woman when I have a strong, devoted man by my side. I'm not devoted, I'm paid, Jack had reminded her. Something had flickered in her eyes then, hurt perhaps or just fatigue. Of course I didn't mean to imply otherwise. The board meeting had been Jack's first real taste of Eleanor's world. She'd insisted he attend, dressed in a suit that cost more than his monthly rent, tailored overnight by her personal stylist. He'd sat silently beside her as she'd calmly, methodically shot down every attempt to diminish her authority. As you can see, gentlemen, I am perfectly capable of continuing my duties as CEO, she'd said, her voice still beneath silk. My personal life is flourishing. My treatment is progressing well, and my vision for this company remains clear. Any further attempts to question my competence will be seen for what they are, opportunistic power grabs. The men around the table, and they were all men, Jack had noted, had exchanged glances. One, a silver-haired man with cold eyes, had stared directly at Jack. And your friend, what exactly is his role in all this? Before Eleanor could answer, Jack had leaned forward. I'm here to support Eleanor in whatever way she needs. Some might call that love. Others might call it basic human decency. Either way, I'm not going anywhere. The room had fallen silent. Eleanor's hand had found his under the table, squeezing briefly in what might have been gratitude or warning. After the meeting, as they'd walked to the car, she'd finally spoken. That was unexpected. Thank you. Don't thank me. I just didn't like his tone, Jack had replied. Those guys are sharks. Yes, they are. And you just jumped into the tank with them. She'd looked troubled. Be careful, Jack. These people play for keeps. He'd soon learn just how right she was. 2 weeks later, as Jack was picking Lily up from school, a man had approached them in the parking lot. Mr. Mitchell, a word please. It was the silver-haired man from the board meeting. Up close, his smile was even less reassuring. Lily, wait in the car, Jack had said, handing his daughter the keys. Once she was safely inside, he turned to the man. What do you want? I want to understand your arrangement with Eleanor Prescott, the man had said smoothly. It seems unusual for a woman of her standing to suddenly become involved with someone like you. Someone like me, a mechanic, a single father from the wrong side of town. Not exactly Eleanor's usual type. Jack had felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. I don't think Eleanor's type is any of your business, Mr. Harrington. Richard Harrington. I've been on the Prescott board for 30 years. I knew Eleanor's father well. His smile had thinned, and I know when something doesn't add up. How much is she paying you, Mitchell, to pretend to be her boyfriend while she fights this illness? Jack's blood had run cold. You're way off base, am I? $500,000 for 6 months, wasn't it? That's quite a sum for a man in your position. Enough to change your life. Enough, perhaps, to make you do things you normally wouldn't. Jack had stepped closer, his voice dropping. Stay away from me and my daughter. And stay away from Eleanor. Harrington had merely chuckled. Or what? You'll tell Eleanor I'm threatening you. She already knows I'm her enemy. No, I think I'll make you a counter-offer. $1 million to walk away from Eleanor now. To tell the press it was all a sham. Imagine what that would do to her credibility with the board, with her shareholders. You're trying to destroy her. I'm trying to protect Prescott Media from a woman too emotional, too ill to lead it properly. Eleanor's father understood that business requires a certain detachment. Eleanor has never learned that lesson. Jack had turned away, heading for his car. Not interested. $2 million. Harrington had called after him. Think about your daughter, Mitchell. What kind of father would turn down that kind of security for his child? Jack had stopped his hand on the car door. For one terrible moment, he'd actually considered it. $2 million would set Lily up for life. And wasn't that why he'd taken this job in the first place? For Lily. But then he'd thought of Eleanor, fighting for her life and her legacy simultaneously. Eleanor, who'd called the wrong number in her darkest hour and found someone who cared enough to show up. The kind of father who wants his daughter to be proud of him. He'd answered and gotten into the car. That night, he'd told Eleanor everything. They'd been sitting on the terrace of her mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lily was inside, having been invited for dinner and currently being taught how to play chess by Eleanor's housekeeper. Harrington approached you at Lily's school. Eleanor's face had palled with anger. That crosses a line. He offered me $2 million to walk away and tell everyone our relationship is fake. Jack had said he knows Eleanor about our arrangement. She'd been quiet for a long moment, and you turned him down. Of course I did. Even though it was 4 times what I'm paying you. Jack had run a hand through his hair in frustration. Is that all you think this is about? The money, isn't it? That's why you agreed to this in the first place. I agreed because you needed help and I was in a position to give it. The same reason I showed up at that hospital room. He'd leaned forward, meeting her eyes. The money matters. I won't lie about that. But it's not everything. Something had shifted between them in that moment. A recognition perhaps that their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor had reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his. Thank you, she'd said simply, for being someone I can trust. The next day, Harrington had made his move. Photos had appeared online. Jack entering the Prescott estate late at night. Eleanor handing him what looked like an envelope of cash. Snippets of documents that appeared to outline their arrangement. The story had spread like wildfire. Prescott heiress paying for fake. Boyfriend too full board in public. Eleanor's phone had rung non-stop. Her PR team had gone into crisis mode, but the damage was spreading quickly. Jack had rushed to the mansion to find Eleanor sitting calmly in her study, watching the news coverage with an expression that revealed nothing. I'm so sorry, he'd said as soon as they were alone. This is my fault. Harrington must have had us followed. It's not your fault, she'd replied, her voice steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. This is how the game is played. I just didn't expect him to move so quickly. What do we do now? Eleanor had turned to him, her gaze direct and unflinching. That depends. Are you still in this with me, Jack? Because if you want to walk away, I wouldn't blame you. This is about to get ugly, and you and Lily never signed up for that. The mention of his daughter had made Jack pause. How would this affect Lily? The other kids at school, the whispers, the judgment. But then he thought about the lesson he wanted to teach her. About standing by people when things got tough. About not running when the road got rocky. I'm not going anywhere, he'd said firmly. But we need a new strategy. Denying it won't work. They have documents, photos. Eleanor had smiled then, a slow, calculating smile that reminded Jack that beneath her vulnerable exterior was a woman who'd been raised to run an empire. We don't deny it, she'd said. We own it. And then we flipped the script. The press conference had been Eleanor's idea. With cameras rolling and reporters hanging on every word, she'd stood, before the world, Jack by her side, and told the truth, or a version of it that turned Harrington's attack on its head. Yes, when Jack and I first met, our relationship began as an arrangement. She'd admitted, her voice clear and unwavering. I was scared facing a diagnosis that terrified me, and I reached out to the wrong number in the middle of the night. But instead of hanging up, this man, this extraordinary man, showed up at my hospital room, a complete stranger who came because someone needed him. She'd looked at Jack, then, and the emotion in her eyes hadn't been feigned. After that night, yes, I offered Jack a position as my companion during my illness. I needed someone I could trust, someone with no connections to my world or its politics. What I didn't expect was how quickly this arrangement would become something real, something true. Jack had taken her hand then, a gesture that had started as support, but had felt like something more. The money was never the point, he'd said, speaking directly to the cameras. The point was that sometimes, people need other people, even billionaire Heiresses, even single dads from the wrong side of town. The press had eaten it up. The narrative had shifted overnight from scandal to love story. The billionaire and the mechanic finding each other through a wrong number and a midnight act of kindness. Wrong number love had trended 4 days. Harrington had been furious. Of course, his plan to discredit Eleanor had backfired spectacularly. The board, sensing which way the wind was blowing, had publicly reaffirmed their confidence in her leadership. But Jack knew the battle was far from over. What he hadn't expected was how the line between pretense and reality would continue to blur. As Eleanor's treatments progressed, as he spent more time at the mansion, as Lily became a regular visitor who brightened Eleanor's darkest days with her chatter and energy, the arrangement had begun to feel less like an act and more like life. The night everything changed had been ordinary in many ways. Eleanor had just finished a particularly brutal round of treatment. Jack had brought dinner, takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, and they'd eaten in the small sitting room adjacent to her bedroom where she could rest comfortably. The doctors say the treatment is working, she told him, picking at her pad Thai. The tumors are shrinking. That's amazing news, Jack had said, relief washing over him. We should celebrate. Let's not jinx it, she'd replied, but she'd been smiling, a real smile, not the camera-ready one she wore for the public. But yes, it's good news. For the first time, I'm starting to believe I might actually beat this thing. They'd talked for hours that night about everything and nothing. Lily's science project, the classic car Jack had been restoring in his limited spare time, Eleanor's plans for expanding Prescott Media's digital platforms. Somewhere in the middle of it all, Eleanor had fallen asleep, her head resting against Jack's shoulder. He'd sat there, not moving, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, the way her copper hair caught the lamplight, the vulnerability in her sleeping face, and he'd realized with a clarity that took his breath away that he was in love with her. Not the arrangement, not the fantasy they'd created for the world, but her, Eleanor Prescott, with all her strength and fear and determination. The realization had terrified him. This wasn't part of the deal. This wasn't supposed to happen. And even if by some miracle she felt the same way, what then? They came from different worlds. Her life was board meetings and galas and private jets. His was oil changes and parent-teacher conferences and clipping coupons to make ends meet. He gently extricated himself, laying her down on the sofa and covering her with a throw blanket. As he'd turned to leave, her hand had caught his wrist. Stay, she'd murmured, her eyes still closed. Please, Jack, just stay. And he had, sitting in the armchair across from her, watching over her as she slept, his heart full of a feeling he had no right to have. The next morning, Eleanor had been different, more distant, more formal. Jack had wondered if she'd sensed the shift in him, if she was trying to re-establish the boundaries of their arrangement. I think we should take Lily to the beach house this weekend, she'd said, over breakfast, not quite meeting his eyes. The press has been quiet lately. It would be good to be seen out together, looking happy and normal. Sure, Jack had agreed, trying to ignore the sting of her business-like tone. Lily would love that. The beach house had turned out to be a sprawling oceanfront property on a private stretch of coastline. Lily had been beside herself with excitement, running from room to room, exclaiming over the view and the private pool and the home theater. "This place is sick," she declared using her latest favorite slang term. "Can we live here forever, Dad?" Jack had laughed, but there had been an H beneath it. "It's not ours, kiddo. We're just visiting." Eleanor, overhearing, had given him an odd look, but said nothing. That evening, after Lily had finally exhausted herself and gone to bed, Jack and Eleanor had sat on the deck, overlooking the ocean, a bottle of wine between them. Eleanor had been cleared to have a glass occasionally, and tonight she'd indulged, her cheeks flushed with color that had nothing to do with illness. "Lily asked me something interesting today," she'd said, breaking a comfortable silence. "She asked if I was going to be her new mom." Jack had nearly choked on his wine. "I'm sorry about that. Kids our age, they get ideas. I told her I didn't know." Eleanor had continued as if he hadn't spoken, "Because that would be up to you and to her and to me. And none of us have really talked about what happens when our 6 months are up." Jack had set down his glass, his heart hammering. "Eleanor, our arrangement ends next month," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "The treatments are working. The board is firmly back in my corner. Harrington's been neutralized, at least for now. You'll get your final payment and you and Lily can go back to your lives." "Is that what you want?" he'd asked, unable to keep the emotion from his voice. She'd finally looked at him, then really looked at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "What I want," she'd said slowly, "is for you to stay, not for the cameras, not for the board, not for any reason except that I've fallen in love with you, Jack Mitchell, and with your amazing daughter. And I don't want to go back to a life without either of you in it." The world had seemed to stop in that moment. Jack had reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "I love you too," he'd said simply. "I've been trying not to because it seemed impossible. We're from different worlds, Eleanor." "No," she'd replied, squeezing his hand. "We're not. We're just two people who found each other because of a wrong number and a choice to show up when it mattered. Everything else, the money, the company, all of it, that's just circumstance. It's not who we are." "And who are we?" he'd ask, moving closer to her. "We're the people who choose each other," she'd whispered. "Every day in big ways and small ones. That's what matters." When he'd kissed her then, it hadn't been for the cameras or the narrative or the arrangement. It had been real. As real as the stars above them and the ocean before them and the future suddenly opening up before them. 3 months later, Eleanor had been declared cancer-free. The celebration at the Prescott mansion had been intimate, just Jack, Lily, Eleanor, and a few close friends. As the evening had wounded down, Eleanor had taken Jack's hand and led him to the garden to a secluded bench beneath a flowering trellis. "I have something for you," she'd said, reaching into her pocket. "It's not exactly traditional, but then nothing about us has been." She'd handed him a small box. Inside was a key, an ordinary house key on a simple ring. "What's this?" he'd asked, turning it over in his hand. "It's a key to our home," she'd replied. "If you want it to be, I bought a place. Not this mansion, not your apartment, but somewhere new. Somewhere that could be ours. All three of us. Somewhere we could start fresh without arrangements or expectations or different worlds colliding. Just us building something real." Jack had looked at the key in his palm, emotion welling up in his throat. "Or are you asking me to move in with you?" "I'm asking for more than that," Eleanor had said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I'm asking you and Lily to stay with me forever, to be my family." In that moment, Jack had thought about the journey that had brought them here. A wrong number in the middle of the night, a hospital room, an arrangement that had become so much more. He'd thought about all the reasons it shouldn't work, all the obstacles they'd faced and would likely face in the future. And then he'd thought about Eleanor, her strength, her kindness, the way she'd bonded with Lily, the way she'd fought for her life and her company with equal determination. He'd thought about how she made him feel not just loved but seen, valued for exactly who he was. "Yes," he'd said, closing his fingers around the key. "We'll stay forever." Eleanor's smile had been like sunrise breaking over the horizon, bright and full of promise. "I was hoping you'd say that." Later that night, after Lily had been tucked into bed in one of the mansion's many guest rooms, Jack had found Eleanor in her study, looking out at the city lights. "You know," he'd said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "When I got that wrong number call at 20 older AM, I never imagined it would lead to this." She'd leaned back against him, fitting perfectly in his embrace. "Sometimes the wrong number is exactly the right one," she'd murmured. "Sometimes the universe knows what we need better than we do." And as they'd stood there together, looking out at the future stretching before them, Jack had known with absolute certainty that showing up that night had been the best decision he'd ever made. Not because it had led to wealth or comfort or security, though those things were nice, but because it had led him to Eleanor, to love, to family, to home. Sometimes the wrong call at 20 AM is exactly the right one. Sometimes showing up for a stranger changes everything, and sometimes staying forever is the easiest promise to keep. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected love and second chances, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories that remind us how life's biggest blessings often come from the most unexpected places. Remember, sometimes the wrong number might just be the right call that changes your life forever.